Welcome to today's episode of the Cross Labs podcast, On My Mind.
We could basically talk about how one could actually do open source AI, the way that Linux became this massive open source project with volunteer work, versus the sort of current model of we're totally a nonprofit and our holding company has investors who are giving us hundreds of millions of dollars to, make a profit.
So in all the previous examples of open source software development and whatnot, is there any other point of reference where you just don't develop, but then you have to literally burn cash into, let's call it maturing the whatever you develop? Because let's say someone comes up in the basement of his house with the best way to train a massive LLM, but then to go and prove it, you need to train a massive LLM, and that costs an insane amount of money. Is there any other example where there is a cost to have it working?
Labor is the usual cost, and the way that gets resolved is that the project lives or dies based on how much people actually want to volunteer for it. The transition I think that open source projects make when they mature is that people become dependent on them to the degree that even companies don't want them to fail or stop being maintained.
Are you saying you can't get the compute without paying for it? Or you do actually this SETI at home thing? What I mean by that is that everybody provides some compute for free.
Yeah, well, I was trying to figure out for stability what fraction of their money is going to compute, what fraction of their money is going to labor, and what fraction of their money is going to legal and other things. And I think probably a quarter of it is just going to pay salaries, because their salary range is $100,000 to $200,000 US a year per engineer, and they've got 188 employees, although 100 of them are external contractors, and who knows how much they're getting paid. But then you also have to include overhead and paying for health insurance and stuff for the employees. They're paying like $2 million a month to hire people to work on the stuff. And assuming that the thing is something that people in the community want, you would hopefully replace that with volunteer labor. And if no one cares, it just doesn't get done. You have to be doing something enough people care about that they're actually willing to spend an hour here, an hour there, without expecting to be paid for it. Then if they're spending millions of dollars a month on compute, yeah, of course, some open source project is not going to immediately do that on the one hand. But on the other hand, if I see, how many people are training LoRa's and stuff for Stable Diffusion, or even just how many people contributed compute to train a open source version of AlphaGo, there's some kind of budget where people are willing to donate spare hours on GPUs to train things that they think are sufficiently interesting to bother with. So you could do something. You might not be doing OpenAI, GPT-5, whatever scale training this way. But you certainly would be doing more than one person with their 3090 could do. And then if it actually became something that people depended on, that's when you start to, solicit donations and things from commercial sponsors. But you don't do it as investors.
That would be something like what the Linux Foundation does, that they have funding from, they call it different tiers, but if I remember correctly, the top tier is companies that contribute $500,000 a year just so Linux doesn't die, because there is an insane amount of software and corporations that depend on Linux not dying. So, but they don't own anything, like just a donation.
Yeah, so I'd like to see some kind of scheme like that for kind of important AI models. Or
getting off the ground is also a problem for others. For Linux, for example, you didn't need to crowdsource compute. That's a big advantage. But there's also BitTorrent and these things, and you could probably say they are success stories in some way.
Yeah, I mean, the varying levels. I mean, there are crowdsourced compute projects that have been successful. They sell themselves as being important. So SETI at home leans on the sort of reputation of SETI, and generally people are I could discover aliens. I could personally be the one who processes the signal that has an alien message in it, that kind of thing. I guess the question is how feasible would it be to trigger that happening for something like an open source version of, say, Suno?
Are we talking about the OpenAI stuff?
You're here.
Oh, hi. Yeah, sorry, I snuck in.
You just Lisa wanted to talk about something else, but when you were here, and I think you just missed each other. But no, we're talking about how Imad Mostak left Stability and was sort of generally pessimistic about the possibility of actually making open source AI in any kind of company with sort of centralized investor control.
That's it for this week's episode of the Cross Labs podcast, On My Mind. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you'll be the first to know when the next episode is out. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.